Yeah? Okay. When I introduce Luca, I have to say some sentences about the John Weingart's Institute, I think, because Luca is Chief Executive Director of the John Weingart's Institute. That is an international educational company founded in 1983 by John Weingart. Hans, we know him. And it is one of the leading independent think tanks promoting gender equality, sexual ethics, democratic governance, and accountability in the Roman Catholic Church. And the Weingart's Institute has educational websites who provide free information to more than 800,000 followers, visitors a year and more. So it's a very important institution, and Luca is the executive director. And Luca, you have a long-standing interest in the governance of the Catholic Church. In 2012, you published a big book about 304 pages about democracy in the Christian Church, a historical, theological, and political case. So it's very, very useful for us to have you in our community, and to have you as a friend and a co-worker for our ambitions in Catholic reform. You also worked on ethics of using contraceptions, and that was a paper who presented at the UN General Assembly in New York, and it was very, very widely seen and heard. So you are a profound member of the scientific community. You worked on gender theologies, LGBT and Catholicism, and you worked, and I heard that speech from you in Lisbon about Jesus' female disciples, a new evidence. And it was very interesting, and I remember I have very good remembering for that. So we are very glad that you work on the Constitution for the Catholic Church. And therefore I have to say some sentences about our beginnings of Constitution work. The Priests Initiative, founded by Helmut, became very soon international, and in 2014, several priests initiatives of several different countries and lay-led reform groups joined together to form the ICRN, the International Church Reform Network. In this organization, we started a working group for justice in the church. Helmut was involved in this group, and the first proposals for a church constitution emerged. This involved decentralization, separation of powers, participation, accountability, and so on. We are very pleased with the work of Luca, who has continued these initial endeavors and worked with many international experts on this. There is now a proposal for a church constitution that has already been submitted to the synodal office. It remains to be seen whether the synod will take up this excellent and competent work. In any case, it would be a great help when it comes to synodality in our church. So please, Luca. it's your time. Tell us about your work on the Constitution and about the Constitution itself.
Thank you very much, Marta, for the very kind words of introduction. Can everybody hear me? Yes? Okay, fantastic. And thank you also, Con, for the invitation and you all for being here. It's very excited to be able to be talk about this. Now, as a sort of Marta has mentioned, the Constitution builds on much previous excellent work. But my thinking in the presentation is not to delve too much into the process of creating this constitution, of coming up with it. As I said, it builds on a lot of previous work. We can discuss. I can go more into details maybe in the question time if there is interest. My focus is to just give a summary of its content because that's how it should be judged more than like whoever signed it or how many people are supporting it. More, I want to focus more about the substantive content of it. And really, it is, somebody has just said, it's a sort of dreaming us out of the nightmare. And this is really what it is. It's a bit of an idealistic piece of work, I would say. It's the result of a thought experiment, really. What would the structure of the Catholic Church look like if the miracle had happened? That is, what would it look like if all the liberating possibilities of that the gospel calls for were to be implemented? Now, the goal of such a thought experiment is to assess whether and to what extent proposals for church reform can be brought together into a whole that is coherent, pragmatic, by which I mean feasible, as well as compatible with biblical studies, theological research, and especially ecumenical dialogues. The idea of a church constitution isn't new. The Vatican itself, you may be surprised to hear, worked for more than 10 years on just such a constitution before eventually deciding to shelve the finished draft in 1980, just before the publication of the new Code of Canon Law 3 years later. Then during the 90s, Professor Leonard Swidler coordinated a team of academics to draft another such proposal, this time an informal proposal, which was envisaging a much more democratic church, as you can imagine, than the Vatican draft was. Now, our latest offer builds on their effort and on the effort of many excellent resources created by We Are Church in particular, as well as on the constitutional documents of some other Christian churches. So that's the ecumenical dimension of it. So let me just start straight away then to sketching a few of its features. The starting assumption of this latest constitution is the co-responsibility of all baptized for the church's mission and governance. This requires the rejection of the belief that only a self-perpetuating male priestly caste has the exclusive responsibility in that regard. I mean, I know I'm preaching to the choir here, but you know that such clericalism is, first of all, unchristian before anything else, because it goes against the New Testament affirmation that there is now only one mediator between God and humanity, Jesus Christ, the eternal high priest. That's according to the letter to the Hebrews. A Christian priesthood, understood as a mediatorial priesthood that mediates grace between the divine and humanity, goes against that simple insight. And in fact, we see that the New Testament never uses the word priest for any Christian minister, something which was absolutely revolutionary in the Judaism of the day. The Judaism, Second Temple Judaism, so-called, was still very much a priesthood religion with a Levitical priesthood, Aaronic priesthood, centered around worship in the temple in Jerusalem. Apart from Jesus the high priest, the only other subject described as priestly in the New Testament is the entire people of God. Now, and I will come back on this point, clericalism is also immoral because it deprives all women and all laymen of the God-given rights and responsibilities which are theirs, both as free, rational, and responsible creatures, and as baptized people commissioned by Jesus to spread the good news. For it is Jesus himself, of course, who gave to all of his followers, women and men, slaves and free, the mission to preach the good news to the end of the earth, the Spirit, and the commission to be agents of God's kingdom of peace and justice. So the Constitution states, and I quote, all Catholics are co-responsible for the fulfillment of the Church's mission and therefore have an inalienable right to participate in its government, either directly or via freely chosen representatives. So that's the first principle. The second principle of the Constitution is the separation of powers. It starts from the recognition that there are many tasks in the Church, not just making decisions for common action, but also teaching, preaching, pastoral care, financial administration, settling disputes, and so on. No single minister can or should be responsible for everything. Otherwise, we get both incompetence and abuse of power. And this is key, of course. If any minister is responsible for everything, that means the job won't be done properly, and there is a much higher risk of abuse of power. On the contrary, there must be a division of labor, of responsibilities, and so a separation of powers. The powers generally recognized in the Church are five. The first three are the familiar ones. There is the legislative power of making laws, the executive power, the judicial power of settling disputes, which in canon law are distinguished only theoretically. Those three powers, they're distinguished theoretically, but they are regarded as all part of the so-called power of governance, which, you guessed it, is the exclusive preserve of ordained people, ordained men only. Now, in addition to the legislative, executive, and judicial powers, canon law also recognizes two more powers, the power of teaching and that of administering the sacraments, also called the sacramental power or the power of order. The exercise of all five powers is controlled exclusively by the ordained people. That's according to current canon law. Now, in contrast, the separation of powers, which is envisaged by the Constitution, requires that a person or a body holding any one of those powers shall not concomitantly hold any of the others. The most obvious consequence is that of breaking up the current centralization of all different functions and powers into the ordained ministry. The Constitution requires that anyone exercising the sacramental power be excluded from church governance, among other things. So if you are elected as a decision maker in the church, say to a fully representative and deliberative pastoral council or synodal council, and I will come back to this later, you should not also ordinarily be an ordained minister or, for example, an ecclesiastical judge. We will see later how the Constitution mandates for specialized expertise to be part of the decision-making process. Finally, the separation of powers recommends that none of those elected to such legislative assemblies should at the same time also exercise executive, judicial, sacramental, or teaching powers. Specifically, shocking as it may sound, as I just mentioned, so-called ordained ministers should not normally be elected to such assemblies. The reason is what I've sort of touched on earlier. Church government requires skills, talents, and charisma different from pastoral work and from administering sacraments. There are different ministries which should be fulfilled by different people. The third principle flowing from the first two is the principle of representation. If all baptized have the right and responsibility to participate in the governance of the church, and they are co-responsible for it, then there needs to be structural representation. It's simply because of the size of the church, of course. You don't need representation in a small group. In bigger groups, you do. Now, the key Catholic doctrine that affirms that the consent of the faithful and this is important, the key Catholic doctrine that affirms that the consent of the faithful is normative for doctrinal definitions will continue to remain a piece of empty rhetoric for as long as there are no structures in place to allow for that consent to be expressed and for its existence to be verified. And again, I will come back to this, but this is sort of the main principle. The same applies to the frequently mentioned commitments to the co-responsibility of all the baptized, and most recently to synodality. Concretely, the principle means that all baptized must be recognized the right to elect people to lead the church. It also means that ordinarily the principal decision-making body at every level of church life will be an assembly of just such elected representatives, a bit like pastoral councils, but elected, mandatory, and with deliberative powers. Such assemblies would discern together and agree policies and priorities to guide the action of ministers working in all areas of church life. So including those we call ordained ministers, whose exclusive responsibility will be pastoral care. A crucial part of that common discernment will also concern, of course, the allocation of use of church assets. And finally, the people elected to those assemblies should also ordinarily serve for a limited term of office, recommended to be 5 years. This is simply sort of best practice around the world. It's got a number of reasons behind them that are fairly intuitive. It's always best to sort of renew the leadership regularly in order to avoid abuses of powers and sort of grow incompetence or complacency. Now, you will have noticed that I mentioned all the insight that the consent of the faithful is normative for determining doctrine. You are probably all familiar with the fact that Lumen Gentium 12 went even beyond that traditional insight to affirming that it is not just normative, but infallible. An affirmation which I've left out because I've really been unable, well, not just I, but it's unclear what kind of biblical basis it has, the infallibility of the whole church, that is. But be as it may, the more modest claim that the consent of the church is for all practical purposes, and here we agree, to be regarded as the best available proxy for determining doctrine, discerning the good news, is based on complementary insights and evidence from the Bible, certainly, church history and theological reflection, as well as philosophical reflection. Now, I won't be able to go into any of them now. We can pick and choose maybe during the discussion time, if you're interested, but I would simply like to quote the main bit of the Constitution on the aspect of consent. And it's a quote that basically echoes the position, a long-standing position in church history, but that was sort of crystallized during the debates at the First Vatican Council in 1870, debating on papal infallibility. Official church laws and doctrine, and that's the quote from the Constitution, official church laws and doctrines passed by church representatives must reflect the consent of the churches to which they apply, and they are to be regarded as valid for as long as they enjoy that consent. So there was talk of the antecedent at the First Vatican Council. The position of the minority was very clear, which was a traditional position, very clear that by consent of the church, one should understand that the consent of the church should be antecedent, concomitant, and subsequent to any papal definition. So it needs, a papal definition is to have the consent of the church before it is made as its precondition, when it is made, and then it needs to maintain it afterwards. That's what's sometimes called reception. If something is not received by the people of God, is the subsequent consent, then it's not valid. Now, Explicit consent is verified by means of the legitimate legislative process through elected representatives. As long as everything is legitimate, the representatives are duly elected democratically, then of course one can assume that whatever is decided enjoys the consent of the church. Tacit consent is verified by means of a process of reception of laws and doctrines to be ascertained whenever needed by means of independent sociological surveys. Something that would only be needed in sort of exceptional cases, I should think. And this is the bit. This is the link also with the current Code of Canon Law, which at the very beginning has an important section. Well, towards the beginning, are canons 23 to 28, which you can read online. It's the section about custom, which is put at the very start of the Code of Canon Law because it's quite important. Custom as a source of law. Custom in canon law can determine both the creation and the revocation of church laws. In fact, the current Code of Canon Law states that if a church law is disregarded for more than 30 years, it can be repealed by the competent authority. It's ground for repeal. That's another way basically to express the insight, which is runs throughout the Constitution, according to which it is the consent of the church, the consensus ecclesiae, which determines church beliefs and practices. Now, the fourth principle, and here we go on a terrain which is perhaps less familiar, the fourth principle is the need to integrate the relevant expertise in church decision-making. We all know that often church decisions require specialist knowledge. Could be of the Bible, of theology, pastoral practice, of the practices and beliefs of the people of God at large, which needs to be checked, to be, checked in the sense of found out, uncovered through sociological surveys, for example, with the help of sociologists, but also of other secular disciplines which may be relevant to the issue at hand. And yet we cannot expect the people elected to church assemblies to be specialists in all the relevant disciplines that they might need in making decisions. Hence the question, how can we ensure that church decision-making is informed by the relevant evidence? Now, on this issue, the Constitution borrows from the best practice of contemporary liberal democracies, in particular here in the UK. Here's the key bit, and I quote from the Constitution. Should a decision require specialist knowledge, church representatives and leaders, both individually or in groups, have a legal duty to seek and take into account relevant and independent expert advice. Have a legal duty to seek and take into account relevant and independent expert advice. End of quote. Elsewhere, the Constitution adds, and I quote again, membership of independent expert advisory bodies shall be selected via an open and transparent peer review process, whose criteria for selection must include relevant expertise, lack of conflict of interest, independence from church representatives and church leaders, and good standing within the relevant scientific community. Those are all they're basically the same criteria which is required in civil society for somebody to be a member of the so-called scientific advisory committees, which are more and more used by governments, especially in the West, to provide evidence to policymakers, independent evidence to policymakers. So the result would be no more doctrinal decisions which ignore the Bible, history, theology, or the relevant secular disciplines. What's not to like? The fifth and final principle has to do with determining the most appropriate level for taking decisions, particularly doctrinal decisions. It has the somewhat technical name of subsidiarity, and it is absolutely crucial in a worldwide church whose constituent national churches hold considerably different beliefs and practices on many issues. Think about the role of women, think about the role, the role of LGBT people, and so on. So here's the relevant extract from the Constitution, and I quote, "Every decisional level in the church has an inalienable right and responsibility to determine both what decisions and action fall within their competence and what instead should be decided by delegation to the higher level." Conversely, that's the other part. Conversely, each higher decisional level may only undertake those decisions and actions which the lower level freely delegates to them, and may not impose restrictions on the lower levels as to matters for decision or action without their consent. Elsewhere, the Constitution explains, and I quote, "At every level of the Catholic Communion, a church has the right, compatibly with its belonging to the one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church, to interpret the deposit of faith, pass doctrinal decisions, and determine doctrinal standards and the limits of permissible theological opinion." End of quote. What this means in practice is a decentralization which includes doctrinal issues. Different national churches already hold different doctrinal beliefs. For example, in some churches, as you know, the majority of Catholics regard the ordination of women and the blessing of same-sex union as called for by the good news. In others, they regard them as utterly contrary to it. And of course, those doctrinal differences can be even more evident from an historical perspective, which highlights doctrinal beliefs once commonly accepted, which are today largely abandoned. Slavery, for example, but the list could be very, very long indeed. If you open, and I'm going off track for a moment here, but if you open the Acts of the Apostles, chapter 15, where there is the Council of Jerusalem, and read what the decision is made about what is required of pagans to abstain from eating blood and so on, the vast majority, there are 4 requirements, if I'm not mistaken, more or less 3 of which are by and large largely disregarded nowadays. The eating of blood and others is completely, it was regarded as the most momentous doctrinal decision back then, and it's in the Bible, it's in the New Testament. It's largely disregarded now. And of course, to go back, so I was saying those doctrinal differences can be even more evident from an historical perspective. Now, each church will have to consider through its own participatory structures, and that's whether they regard each divergence as fatal for maintaining cooperation with churches whose beliefs and practices are different. Hopefully, in doing so, they will take into account the evidence from independent experts in the relevant disciplines, as I said earlier, which should help sort of moderate maybe the positions. And in the case, hopefully rare, in which they still conclude that full cooperation is no longer appropriate, they will be, of course, entitled to decide which level of cooperation they would be comfortable with. Of course, most national churches may also determine that those issues are best dealt with at the universal level and agree to abide by whatever decisions are taken there. In that case, such a discernment should be carried out ordinarily by a council of representatives from around the world, what would be known as an ecumenical council. While the above sketch of subsidiarity may sound a recipe for chaos, respect for the freedom of conscience of every baptized, I think, demands nothing less. A culture of respectful mutual listening and dialogue among churches is the only way to allow individuals and local churches to act according to their deeply held, prayerfully discerned beliefs about what the gospel requires of them in their own specific societies and cultures. It is also a way to make the rich doctrinal diversity of Catholicism more public and so easier to negotiate. Because I think you're all aware of the extent to which the hierarchy tries always to give an impression of uniformity. Well, there really is very little uniformity. The global Catholic Church is enormously varied. Now, I don't want to talk for too long. Maybe just quickly, one final aspect of the Constitution which I'd like to highlight, to stress more. I've sort of touched on it before, but because it is the environment without which a church, I believe, withers and dies. It is the defense of the human rights to freedom of conscience and expression. Or put differently, it is the affirmation of the vital need for open and public debate and discussion within the church. I suspect most Catholics, although you guys may be an exception, but most Catholics are unaware of the extent to which both freedoms are suppressed in the Catholic Church. Let me just highlight a few factors, each of which is pretty crucial in itself. First is the above-mentioned fact that about 60 years after Vatican II, the restatement at Vatican II of the old belief that the consent of the whole church is a norm for all doctrinal and moral teachings, there are still no formal institutional channels to verify the existence of such a consensus. Pastoral councils, as you know, are not mandatory. In any case, they're not representative and they're not deliberative. And the same applies to synods. Indeed, despite all the talk of synodality, the current canon law concerning synod, which has been amended recently in 2018 by Pope Francis itself, is as anti-democratic as it gets. We can discuss the details later if you wish, but the bottom line is that according to current canon law, at every level, diocesan, national, or international synods can only be called by the bishops or the Pope. They alone can set the agenda, choose whether any lay people should be allowed in, and if so, who, and finally decide whether or not to accept any synodal decision. So this is sort of the bottom line, really. Compounding the dire absence of institutional channels for public debate is what canon law states about the duty of obedience of Catholics towards the hierarchy and the prohibition for them to publicly dissent from the latter. Private dissent is allowed if you write a letter privately to the bishop. That's allowed. If you go public, canonically, you're in danger. According to current canon law, Catholics are obliged to obey all doctrinal or moral pronouncements by Pope and bishops. Furthermore, publicly criticizing those pronouncements is potentially a criminal offense, liable in theory to a so-called canonical penal trial. That's a criminal trial for you. To be clear, the obligation to obey extends to all non-dogmatic, non-infallible teachings. The canon law calls them authentic. That means normal, ordinary teachings of Pope and bishops. That is, given that dogmatic teachings are very, very few, it extends to virtually all magisterial teachings, both in the doctrinal and in the moral fields. Concretely, that has meant that Catholics are bound by canon law to agree with, obey, and refrain from publicly criticizing the prohibitions of artificial contraception, premarital sex, divorce, remarriage, women's ordination, same-sex relationships, and so on everything you have to toe the party line. Neither is that obligation to obey merely academic. The vast majority of canonical penal trials and condemnations of theologians and others of the past few decades have been for public criticism to that category of non-dogmatic teachings, and particularly the papal teachings on sexual ethics or women's ordination. And I call them papal teachings because many of them are the private opinion of popes put forward against the beliefs and practices of the vast majority of Catholics, and often the advice of the relevant experts. Contraception is the case in point. So they are papal teaching. They are actually the sort of officialization of private theological opinions of popes, of past popes. Now, it is also worth noting that Catholics who criticize have been condemned by means of penal trials or extrajudicial canonical procedures, which do not respect the most basic international standards of the fundamental human right to fair trial. Among the most egregious breaches of human rights is the fact that in canonical penal trials, including doctrinal trials, proceedings are to be closed to the public, they're secret, and that's against the United Declaration of Human Rights, Article 10 to 11, which mandates proceedings to be public. The accused has no right to examine and cross-examine witnesses. The prosecution also acts as judge, and there is hardly any right of appeal. Plus, a plethora of other procedural the poor practice, I would call it. Our constitution, of course, would fix that by simply stating that those international standards should be mandatory in canon law. Canon law cannot go below those standards. Another consequence of the fact that canon law mandates obedience and prohibits public criticism of any magisterial teaching is the damage it did to the selection of bishops. many of you will know this, but the Vatican guidelines for selecting bishops under John Paul II, and I believe to this day, included a confidential questionnaire that makes the selection of a candidate to the episcopacy dependent on him never having publicly criticized papal teachings on any of those issues. The result, of course, is that bishops are often chosen for their blind loyalty rather than for their capacity for independent critical thinking, among other things, or the theological knowledge, or God forbid, the representativeness of the beliefs and practices of the local church, of their constituents. Last but not least, the academic freedom of theologians too of Catholic theologians is constrained. I don't know how much people are aware of that, but it's very much a very significant problem. All Catholic theology professors are still required to take an oath and never to criticize papal teachings, ordinary teaching of the magisterium, which include papal teaching. Church historian Eamon Duffy very recently described the consequences of the so-called modernist oath, which Pope Pius X required all clerics to take back in 1910, a bit more than a century ago, as having, and I quote, sterilized Catholic theology and biblical study for 2 generations, end quote. The situation today is only moderately better, which is why in many parts of the world, Catholic theology, and particularly Catholic ecclesiology, is decades, if not centuries, behind political philosophy, despite being once deeply intertwined with it. But that's another story. We can talk about it in the question time. In closing, let me stress that there is also a moral reason why a church must be democratic. Democracy is not simply the most efficient polity for improving decision-making. It is also the only one which allows for the inalienable personal responsibility of the human person to extend as much as possible over issues to do with the common action of the community a person is member of. In other words, democracy is the only political system which empowers personal responsibility to grow towards the ideal of co-responsibility. That is, the responsibility for actions taken in concert with others, the responsibility for the outcome of cooperation in the action of a community one is a member of. It is widely accepted that people in their own personal decisions are entitled and indeed bound to follow what they believe in conscience is the right thing to do. Now, democracy is precisely the method for allowing them to exercise that same freedom and responsibility to follow their conscience, but this time with regard to decisions for common action, by allowing them to participate fully in the decision-making process, either directly or through elected representatives, as I said. I cannot overemphasize how important this is. It is a question respecting the God-given dignity of each human being, and indeed of each baptized. Each baptized, as we have said at the start, has a God-given responsibility to work together as a church to spread God's kingdom. That's universally accepted. But nobody can do so responsibly if they are not allowed any participation in the ecclesial decisions. In fact, I'm going to say something that may at first sound shocking, but stay with me. To the extent that the current anti-democratic governance of the Roman Catholic Church does not respect the norms for the individual's cooperation in the common action of a community to be responsible, it is potentially responsible and thus potentially moral for a lay Catholic to cooperate in the common action of the local church. Consider, for example, the morality of donating money in the current setup. Lay donors, and more in general, the whole community to which it is crucial to remember ecclesial assets belong, in theory, have legally no say on how the money will be spent at any level, whether at the level of the parish or the diocese. This means that their money may be used for purposes or projects which they deem and may well objectively be inappropriate, mistaken, even immoral, without them having the possibility of doing much about it from the point of view of canon law. Then in practice, there may be, a good relationship, but I'm just sticking to what canon law says. And the possibilities, of course, of those money being spent unwisely, to say the least, are far from remote for the system, the canon law system does not provide the legal norms binding the only decision maker, who is the bishop at the diocesan level, to be an expert on policymaking and economic administration, nor does it provide any legal warranties that both binds him to consult the competent persons and make him accountable in case of misdeeds. There are some, bishops are bound to an extent especially for bigger expenses to check with their financial counsel, but the canonical constraints are not very strict. So such a blind cooperation with no voice in the discernment for the best course of action possible, no warranty that everything will be done to find it, no that the values and priorities of those donating really are shared by the decision maker, and no ultimate oversight into how the money are spent, is potentially responsible and so potentially immoral. So I will go as far as saying that a church which is not democratic cannot be a fully Christian church, for Jesus called us to freedom, but the Catholic Church continues to be structured as an unequal hierarchical society, keeping most of its members as subjects whose freedom, responsibility, and human rights are strictly limited. In conclusion, let me quote a June 2022 essay by historian, journalist, and former Catholic priest James Carroll that was published on The Atlantic. And I quote, "If Pope Francis had actually revitalized those well-begun church reforms, equality for women and men, an empowered laity, a sacramental ministry of service instead of domination, he would have emerged as what the world needs most right now, a prophet of democratic commonwealth. Think of it, more than 1 billion Catholics crossing every boundary on the planet, fully enlisted at last by virtue of the renewed structures of their own institution in the struggle for human equality, enshrined in self-government, rooted less in a modern dream of democratic liberalism than in the spirit of radical solidarity first seen in Jesus Christ," end quote. I and my colleagues at the Weingarten Institute for Catholic Research agree very much with this, and we would like you also to be part of this. The Constitution has so far been co-signed by more than 60 Catholic theologians, Bible scholars, and canon lawyers, and has received endorsements by high-profile Catholics. But we are still at the beginning. We want to open up the discussion even further. It's not etched in stone. So I'm very much looking forward to our discussion and your suggestions based on the brief sketch I've outlined above. And of course, you'll be able to freely access the text of the Constitution on our website, www.weingarteninstitute.com. It's there in 4 languages, I believe. It's in English, in German, in Spanish, and in French. And I think soon it will be in Italian as well. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Luca. You've covered a huge amount in a very short space of time. Very quickly, I'll pass on to Marta, please, to introduce Helmut Schüller.
Luca, I've got a dream. We have got a dream. Yeah, we will see. I would like now to introduce Helmut to you. He's an Austrian, and I know some little things about his personal church history, and I would like to tell you. Helmut was a pupil, not a victim of Hans Hermann Grohe, you know, the later cardinal who was one of the first to be accused of sexually abusing boys. And he, Cardinal Grohe, was the reason for the Austrian church petition and the founding of We Are Church Austria. Helmut is a priest, and he did everything a priest does, being at school, a teacher, being in parishes, being in the diocese. He worked for the Caritas and was leader for the Austrian Caritas. And in this position, he was in 1993 one of the targets of a letter bomb. And we are very, very, very glad the bomb was discovered in time. After the appointment of Cardinal Schönborn as Archbishop of Vienna, he appointed Helmut to the Vice General, Vicar General, but dismissed him after 4 years due to profound differences of opinion. Hopefully. I know that. I'm glad about that. Now Helmut is a parish priest, the university chaplain of the Catholic University Community of Vienna, and a spiritual assistant of the Catholic University Youth, and many things. Still busy, still very busy, I know. In 2006, he presented with Udo Fischer the Pastor's Initiative to the public, which wanted to support the vocation of all baptized to co-responsibility, co-decision, and co-creation in the church. 2006, nearly 20 years ago. And in 2011, the call to disobedience was published by the Priests Initiative in Austria. And soon after that, in 2012, Helmut was stripped of the honorary papal title of Monsignore by the Holy See. No reason was given for this. What a punishment. He suffered a lot of that. So, and you are, Helmut, you are involved in the work for church constitution since I know you, and this is quite a lot of time. So let us, I'm very curious now for your dialogue of you two, because you are really experts on this. I read the whole proposal and I didn't understand today every word, but I'm so glad we have it. And I'm very sure you have different points to discuss. So please.
Yeah, thank you, Martha, for this welcoming me and for the presentation. And I want to concentrate on some points, I think, influential, which have influence on this work for a constitution. The first point is we have not enough awareness of the necessity of a constitution also in the church.
Mm-hmm.
When I am in dialogue with faithful, they are astonished about such a project. And I'm astonished that they are living on two levels in their life. In their civil life, they are participants of a democratic system, and in church life, they don't miss it for their spiritual and church life. It's a very important problem, I think, for the development and for building up such a constitution as a church with constitution. This awareness is also thinking that this lack of awareness comes from, on the one hand, from this old tradition that making church democratic is opening the door for the spirit of the world, and church has existed 2000 years because it's not democratic. A lot of people in the church are thinking in that direction, I fear. That means the first thing we have to discuss is how to build up this awareness on all levels of the church, but especially at the base of the church. The second issue is, I think we need a special education for constitutional thinking. And that means education and also practice on the parish level. Because when church should have a constitution, this constitution has to live on all levels of church. And on the parish level, we could start with it immediately. The pastors and the communities who are interested in it, and get a lot of experience with this difficult work. Because in the parish communities, for example, we have a lot of priests who are lucky as, let me say, charismatic leaders, not very open for democratic processes in their own parish community, because they are kind of gurus and their friends around them who have the influence on all the developments in the parish communities. And this informal influence on the life of the community would be finished by a constitution. The informality of it would be finished. Instead, there would be built up transparency and and representation of all inside the community. So that means where to begin with this project practically. We have fine drafts. We have very elaborated drafts now. They are not only interesting, but they are clear, as you have presented it, Luca. Yes, they are clear. But the problem is how to get the start of practicing it. Should there be on the top of the church a kind of constitution-giving assembly? Where should it start? Who should it start? And so I think we have to win over the faithful for it. They are not. It is not. This consciousness is not enough developed at the base of the church, and that's Leonhard Zwidler did a lot of work for these parish constitutions. I think his idea was we should have a process on different levels, and the parishes could move forward with it. I think they could take steps as example for the whole church. But when I tell you that I tried to do some such things and to gather pastors who want to develop it, I was not very successful. Yes, because it sounds very abstract. It sounds the language of juridical science and so on and so on. So it's very hard to win them for this work. I'm clear that at the base of this work should be the consciousness of, as you have said, the consciousness that a democratic church is the only, a Christian church has to be a democratic church. And now in Europe, we have a new situation. A growing number of citizens in our countries in Europe are becoming more and more skeptical about democracy. That means there have been better times for a constitution for the church, because now we have to defend our societies and the democracy in our societies. That means we have two fronts. the front of inside the church and the front in society. And idealistically spoken, I think this work for a constitution in church will become part of our defending of democracy in society also. That means the example of the church open to be open for constitution and for fundamental rights and so on would be a more and more important contribution to the society and to the struggle for democracy in our European societies. So I want to finish at that point because we should have time enough for discussing all the things. It would be discussing your draft and your proposition, Luca, and so I want to stop there at this point.
Luca, do you want to respond first of all to some of the points that Helmut made there?
Yes, sorry, I took me some time to unmute myself. Well, the first thing is mostly that I'm very much in agreement with pretty much everything that Helmut has said, very, very wisely. First of all, I agree that I mean, I don't want simply to reiterate, but it's true. There is, I think, still a big lack of awareness from the grassroots about the need for that. How to address it? I mean, the simple provocation of coming up with such a constitution, in theory, one of the, well, to be honest, because it's such an idealistic project, the main purpose, as I envisaged it, maybe there are others, but as I envisaged it, was precisely to spur a discussion, to make people think, hold on, is that a constitution? Is that even possible? That's why in the sort of accompanying material we stress, we build on, well, we're not build on, but how do you say? We refer to the Vatican initiative in the 70s to do exactly that. It lasted 10 years. It wasn't a short-lived idea. I mean, it was, first of all, they started shortly after the Second Vatican Council, Paul VI wanted a new code of canon law. And as part of that, of a commission of experts, a subcommission was dedicated, if I remember correctly, to thinking about whether a constitution was possible and whether it was desirable. And the answer given at the start was yes and yes. So one thing is that one can always point to the precedent, which helps in the Catholic Church. You know, it's been tried, it's been shelved at the last moment, but it was a finished draft. I mean, in a sense, thanks God it was shelved, because quite frankly, it was very, very monarchical and authoritarian. But that's beside the point. You don't have to say that. The point is, to the questions, is it necessary? Is it suitable? And is it feasible? And is it appropriate? The answer was given yes, 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 by top bishops at the time. Anyway, so one sort of purpose of it is precisely to spur discussion. The other thing that struck me, what Helmut says, is the fact that if it is to start, about the question about whether it should start from the grassroots or whether we should go, I don't know, straight to, I don't know, an ecumenical council or to the Vatican. I think it's a bit of both. I have heard the argument that, sometimes you don't want to make reforms because the people are not ready for it. I've heard the argument, for example, by a very sort of prominent canon lawyer who is advising the current General Synod, that it won't be very it won't matter much to change canon law into making pastoral councils mandatory, because the reasoning goes, you need to change mentalities. You need to change the mentality of people, and first ensure that they have a synodal mentality of people and of bishops, because otherwise the reasoning goes, if you don't have such a synodal mentality, the bishop will find a way of bypassing those councils anyway, which is true, certainly, because the reasoning was the law doesn't change mentality. It's the custom, the mentalities that like make the law, which is fair enough. But also there is, I think, an interaction there. And if you get the law, sometimes the law can help in the development. That's what I'm saying. Is if you make, for example, pastoral councils not just compulsory, but deliberate, with deliberative power, so that they cannot be ignored, well, then, you might get more involvement from the people. You might have reached the point of no return, by which I mean, something that, it's a quote from you, Helmut, that I almost quoted in the speech, something that you said about, that basically a lot of young people are leaving nowadays. We all know that. And that's partly because they are fed up with those sort of bizarre debates about church governance, where in any case they don't have a voice, and the hierarchy, how do you say, is very slippery. And if you have, so we may already have reached the point that even if you were now to establish representative bodies, people are alienated, they won't get involved. We have that problem to an extent in civil society as well with democracy. But at least I think it's worth talking about it first and then trying it. In terms of trying it, I really have to defer to the expertise of most of you guys, because I am a sort of ivory tower academic. I have very little experience on the ground. So if you, Helmut, tells me that, for example, with the idea of constitution at the parish level, parish constitutions, which Leonard Sweetler pushed very much for, and which I think is a great idea, but you are not the first priest who tells me we have tried Leo's idea and it was hard to get it off the ground. I've had Father Paul Huang, I think, from South Korea, so a completely different part of the world, who also tried and told me he had some success, I guess. I can't remember exactly, but I'm sure it's not easy, for probably very many reasons, one of which may be the fact that a lot of people are now alienated, that these are, they don't see the need or the why.
Can we hold it there for the moment?
Yeah.
Luca, thanks very much for that. There are a number of questions coming up in the chat here. If anybody else wants to raise their hand electronically, please do so. I can see it going across the top of the screen here. There's a question here from Elsa to Luca.